Shabbat Shalom. Every year I come back to parashat Korach and I see our eponymous hero / anti-hero differently. It's the contrarian in me. I know that the rabbis are practically shouting at me through time in our tradition to see him as the dishonorable hero of a rebellion. But I hear rebellion, it's the 80s kid in me, and I think he's the good guy. He's Han Solo. And yes, empire must be challenged. And that feels like a completely reasonable conclusion to come to around the holiday of Juneteenth. More on that in a little bit. And then I review the laning for this week, and it becomes ever more clear to me why I struggle with this parsha. It's really confusing. Our best scholarly assessment understands that the rebellion of Korach is most likely a combination of at least 4 different stories of rebellion, with traces of all of them left in the final redacted text. And it's not surprising that at this point in Torah, we might find all of these mentions of mutiny. After all, it was just last week that we experienced this massive failure of leadership in the incident of the spies. Moses sent the best of the best, the putative chiefs, the supposed heads of the tribes, to reconnoiter the land, but the resulting dispirited report angers the people, who in turn anger Moses and God, who in turn decrees that everyone, save Caleb and Joshua, of all the people that God so lovingly ordered to be counted at the beginning of the book of Numbers, will not make it into the promised land. So we find our rebels in a tumultuous time. Contemporary academic Jacob Milgram thus describes the situation in this week's Torah portion. Israel's fortunes have reached a low ebb. Demoralized by the majority report of the scouts and condemned by God to die in the wilderness, the people are psychologically receptive to demagogic appeals to overthrow their leadership and return to Egypt. But I would say that the past 2 decades of civic life here in these United States have made us all too familiar with demagoguery, and I'm just not sure that's the problem of Korach. To me, our text suggests a deeper, more insidious critique at play, which is to say that maybe Korach is a demagogue, but he's not merely a demagogue. One of the most interesting parts of our parsha this week is its deep connection to the paradigmatic story of creation as told in the book of Genesis. So going back to Milgram, he describes our parsha's theme as encroachment on the tabernacle. That is, right, Korach ultimately ends up vying with Aaron for the priesthood. The showdown involves a test of incense offerings, and when Korach and his band of rebels are rejected, the fire pans of the slain aspirants are then hammered into plating for the altar, a warning to future encroachers. And when the people complain about the death of their chieftains, they in turn are afflicted with a deadly plague. And then there's a new test involving the chieftain's staffs again, which proves Aaron's rights to the priesthood. And the parsha ends with a list of perks to be granted to the Levites as recompense for the risks they assume in guarding and transporting the Mishkan, the tabernacle. The building of the Mishkan is, of course, famously understood to be a microcosm of the creation story. The people build a dwelling place for God in the same way that God creates the world for people. And there's direct language parallels in both processes, and both end with similar blessings by Moses and by God. So Korach's encroachment on the Mishkan, on the tabernacle, is a threat to creation itself. What's more, Korach's rebellion ends with the earth swallowing up the insurgents, as Moses predicts when he explains the test of power that God instructs him to set up. In Numbers 16:30. But if God brings about something unheard of, so that the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, you shall know that those involved have spurned God. It's the phrase brings about something unheard of, the imbri'ah yivra, that is of interest to us here. Milgram again. notes of this rendering that it is literally, right, God will create a creation. That is something unprecedented that did not exist before. However, a preferable rendering is makes a great chasm. And in Hebrew, the phrase Bria Yivra is a double use of the same root that appears at the very beginning of Genesis, where we're told Bereshit bara Elohim, when God began to create, in Genesis 1:1. God's response to Korach's descent, then, harkens back to the primordial story of the creation of the world. And later rabbinic tradition makes a similar connection. We learn in the Mishnah of 10 items created by God on the 6th day of creation, right before Shabbat. And the mouth of the earth, Pi Haaretz, referencing the chasm in our story, is the very first one in that list. So the import is clear. God interprets Korach's challenge as not merely one to Moses' authority, but to God's self. And specifically, God's role as sovereign creator of the universe. It's this understanding that leads the Zohar, the sort of 13th century foundational text of Jewish mysticism, to offer as an explanation for Moses' anger that Korach was denying the work of creation. The punishment fits the crime. The rejection of the generative power of the divine is answered with an unprecedented display of the same. So the Jewish Studio Project, a beautiful organization founded by my friend Rabbi Adina Allen, notes of this first verse of the Torah that I quoted earlier. God's first act is one of creativity. The divine is first and foremost a creator. And so it must follow, God is the creative force of the universe, and human beings are made in the divine image. Therefore, human beings are created as creators. Each and every one of us is endowed with creative capacity simply by being human. Accessing and activating our creativity is how we partner with God in the ongoing work of creation. Korach's mistake is misapprehending this fundamental truth. So to go back to where I started, though a rebel, Korach is on the dark side. He's not using the force. He's actively denying the force. But more importantly, to deny the work of creation is to deny what makes us human, which also brings us back to Juneteenth. So the holiday yesterday commemorates the day in 1865, 900 days after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, when Major General Gordon Granger ordered the final enforcement of that proclamation in Galveston, Texas. That day in 1865 was the first time enslaved people in Texas received the news that they were free because the enslavers had worked to keep that news from them. Of course, the abolition of chattel slavery only occurred with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which happened months later in December of that same year. And it's essential to note that the 13th Amendment, which still stands and has not been modified, allows for slavery as a punishment for crime. So we celebrate Juneteenth then as a reminder that the work is not complete. Part of our work in being created as creators is ensuring the creativity of all human beings. And we fail at that when we allow a 1-year-old baby to be shot by police because his mother was suspected of stealing diapers. We fail at that when we allow the Supreme Court to gut voting protections for the very descendants of those enslaved people. And we are failing at that when we allow the existence of an individual trillionaire while refusing to even engage with the idea of reparations. So my blessing for us this Shabbat Korach and this Shabbat Juneteenth is that we recommit ourselves to protecting and engaging with the ongoing work of creation. That we, as God's most precious work, continue to partner with God in engaging and ensuring that all human beings are able to be creative, free from oppression and other limiting forces. And unlike Korach, I believe in this power wholeheartedly. Shabbat Shalom.